All right, let's dive right in. We're going to tackle a really provocative idea today, one that comes from Murray and Rothbard's work For a New Liberty. And it's a big one. What if some of the core systems we've built to protect our society, things we take for granted, are actually forms of involuntary servitude? It's a challenging thought, so let's unpack the argument together.
Okay, so everyone knows the 13th Amendment, right? It's a cornerstone of American history. It formally abolished slavery, a huge, monumental step for liberty. But the source we're digging into today asks a really radical question. Has that amendment really been fulfilled? Or could it be that involuntary servitude still exists, just in forms we don't usually call by that name? Let's see where this goes.
So, to even begin to answer a question that big, we have to get our terms straight. The entire argument we're about to explore, well, it all balances on one specific, and you could say modern, definition of what involuntary servitude actually means.
And here it is. According to this perspective, the definition is actually pretty straightforward. Involuntary servitude has two key ingredients. One, you're being forced to do some kind of work, and two, you're getting paid less for it than you would have freely agreed to on the open market. That's it. Forced labor below market pay. This simple definition is basically the key that's going to unlock every other part of this argument, so you're going to want to keep it in mind.
And here is the constitutional foundation for this whole discussion. The 13th Amendment is incredibly clear. It bans involuntary servitude completely, with one and only one exception. And that exception is incredibly narrow. It's for punishment after you've been properly convicted of a crime. That's the only loophole. So according to the text, the big question becomes, do some of our modern practices actually fall outside of that tiny little exception?
All right, so with that definition firmly in our heads, forced labor at below market wages, let's apply it to the first major example from the source, the military. This is presented as probably the most obvious and maybe the most extreme example of this idea in the modern world.
I mean, when you think about it, the military draft is pretty much the textbook case, isn't it? From this perspective, a person is literally seized by the government, compelled to serve, and their life just isn't their own anymore. They can be sent anywhere, forced to kill, and forced into situations where they can be killed. The argument is simple. If that doesn't fit the definition of involuntary servitude, then what on earth possibly could?
Now, I know what you're thinking, because it's the immediate natural response. But wait, who's going to defend the country if we don't have a draft? It's a question of pure necessity. The source tackles this head-on. It says, well, think about it. Food is absolutely vital, right? But we don't conscript farmers. Healthcare is vital, but we don't conscript doctors. All these other critical services, we get them through voluntary agreements in the marketplace. So the question being posed is, why should national defense be the one exception?
And this chart really visualizes the core of the source's answer. The argument is that there was never a real shortage of soldiers. What there was a shortage of people willing to do an incredibly dangerous job for, frankly, abysmal pay. For a long time, the pay for a buck private, even when you factored in things like food and housing, was just a fraction, maybe half, of what that same person could have earned back home. From Rothbard's point of view, it's basic economics. If you want people to take on hazardous work, you have to pay them more than safe work, not dramatically less.
But here's where the argument goes a step further beyond just the draft. It even questions whether a so-called voluntary enlistment is truly voluntary. I mean, think about it this way. If you're an engineer and you sign a 3-year contract to work somewhere, and halfway through you decide to quit, what happens? Well, you might lose your pay, maybe get a bad reference, but you're not going to be thrown in prison. You're certainly not going to be executed. But if a soldier quits, that's called desertion, and it's a crime punishable by imprisonment or even death. The text argues this makes the enlistment contract a form of bondage that just doesn't exist in any other job on the planet.
And, this isn't some new 20th century idea. The source points out that there's a really deep tradition in America of being extremely skeptical of a standing army. You had figures like Patrick Henry warning that giving the government permanent control over a professional army, giving them the sword and the purse, was a constant temptation for that government to expand its power, both here at home and out in the world.
Okay, so we've looked at the military, which is the most dramatic example. But now the argument pivots, and it starts looking for more subtle, everyday forms of this same principle. Let's see how this lens gets applied to things like taxes and the court system, places you might not expect.
Let's talk about the tax withholding system. You know how every single payday, a chunk of your money is just gone before you ever see it? Well, someone has to do that work. Your employer is legally forced to calculate all your taxes, take that money out of your paycheck, and send it to the government. The argument here is that this makes every single employer in the country an unpaid tax collector for the state. They're being compelled to perform labor, and they're not getting paid a dime for it. It's a system that was put in place as a wartime measure, and, well, it just never went away.
And next up, jury duty. Now, we're all taught to see this as a noble civic duty, right? But this argument flips that on its head. It frames jury duty as just another form of compelled service. You get a summons, you're forced to show up, you're forced to perform a task for the state, sometimes for days or even weeks. And what do you get paid? Pennies on the dollar. The source calls it slave wages and draws a direct line back to military conscription. It's a forced task at way below market pay.
And this critique of the judicial system doesn't stop there. Think about the power of a subpoena. It can force a witness, someone who hasn't done anything wrong, to drop everything and show up to testify. The text also points to the idea of holding people in jail before their trial when they're still legally innocent. And then it points out a little bit of irony. The very people who help write and enforce these laws, lawyers, are often conveniently exempt from having to serve on juries themselves.
All right, now we get to what is, without a doubt, the most controversial and challenging part of this entire argument. The source now turns that same lens of involuntary servitude onto the practice of committing people to mental institutions against their will. It argues that even when the intention is to help, the result can be a form of imprisonment.
Here's the absolute core of it. Compulsory commitment allows a person to be locked away, to have their freedom completely taken from them, not because they've actually committed a crime, but because someone, a doctor, a judge, thinks they might commit a crime in the future. This, the argument claims, is a total rejection of the principle of innocent until proven guilty. You are literally being punished for a crime you have not committed.
To build this case, the source relies heavily on the work of a psychiatrist named Dr. Thomas Szasz, and he was a fierce critic of this practice. He's quoted here just completely dismantling the main justification for commitment, which is dangerousness to others. He calls it a pure fantasy, a convenient story we tell ourselves to justify what he saw as a profound act of tyranny dressed up in the language of medicine.
And this is where it gets really wild. The source backs this up with statistics. Take a look at this. According to the studies it cites, people who have been released from mental hospitals are, on average, statistically less dangerous and less likely to commit crimes than the average person on the street. So the argument poses a logical trap. If we're really concerned about danger, why aren't we preemptively locking up other groups who are statistically more dangerous? The question is meant to expose what it sees as a massive hypocrisy.
So the conclusion on this point is incredibly stark. The source says that calling this kind of forced imprisonment therapy is just a cruel joke. It argues that the minute a person gets labeled mentally ill, they risk becoming a non-person. Their rights can be stripped away, often with even fewer legal protections than an actual convicted felon gets.
Okay, so we've gone through the military, the tax system, the courts, and now compulsory commitment. Let's take a step back and pull all of these threads together to see the big picture, the central question that this whole argument is really about.
What we've really witnessed here is the application of one single powerful idea over and over again. The source takes that initial definition, forced labor at below market wages, and uses it like a special lens. It looks through that lens at all these different practices, things we normally just accept as duty or the way things are, and it reframes them as coercive acts of the state against the individual.
Ultimately, what this entire argument from For a New Liberty is really doing is forcing us to confront a fundamental conflict. On one side, you have the idea of the obligations of a citizen, what you owe to society. And on the other side, you have the rights of what this source would call a self-owned individual. And those two things are often in tension.
And that leaves us right here with this enormous question. After seeing all these examples, from the draft to jury duty, re-examined through this lens, where do you draw the line between a civic duty and an act of coercion? It's a really tough question, and it forces you to think about what freedom truly means to you.
We've just walked through a really challenging argument about liberty and coercion. If you enjoy digging into complex ideas like this that really make you think, then I hope you'll stick around for more. Please, subscribe to this channel. Thanks for watching.